Welcome to the dinner table, a discussion with food as a lens into cultures and societies. I'm your host, Fred Opie. Today on the Fred Opie Food Show, I speak with Paul Freedman about his new book, 10 Restaurants That Changed the World. I have published a chapter in a previous book co-edited with Paul, Ken Albala, and Joyce Chaplin, entitled Food in Time and Place, that was published in 2014. Paul is a professor of history at Yale University, and I look forward to speaking with him about his new book, 10 Restaurants That Changed the World. What was the inspiration for researching and writing the book?
Well, I should say first that my day job is as a historian of the Middle Ages. That's what I was hired to teach, and I've been doing that for about 30 years. The inspiration was an exhibit at the New York Public Library about 15 years ago, actually, of menus from New York restaurants. The New York Public Library has about 40,000 menus, so this is a little selection of their menus, and I was fascinated by the menus, their design, but also how different what people ate 100 years, 150 years ago was from what we eat today. And I wanted to do something that would talk about American cuisine from the point of view of restaurants.
You know, you mentioned your day job, you do medieval history, is that what you said?
That's right.
So how did you get into the field of food history? I know I started out with a kind of a different scenario as well. My fields as a graduate student were in colonial America, modern America, and Latin America. So at what point did your career begin to intersection with the interest in food history?
Well, I had done a lot of work on peasants in the Middle Ages and on Spain in the Middle Ages and the church in the Middle Ages. So various themes having to do with medieval society and culture. I was struck in working on peasants by how much of the stereotype of peasants and satire about peasants and contempt for peasants centered around food, that they ate this lowly food in those days that would be considered gruel, dairy products, root vegetables, and somehow how funny this was. And then I thought, well, you know, it's not uncommon that rich people think that their food is more virtuous and that the food of poor people is somehow comical. In our country, that overlaps a lot with race, as of course you know quite well, or ethnicity, or class. So I wrote a book about spices in the Middle Ages because that's what the upper class liked. And so there the idea was that I would look at why this ingredient, this condiment, was so prestigious. So that was really my introduction into food history. And then from that, considering modern America instead of medieval Europe was a relatively easy step.
So for the newest book, tell me about the sources that you found and used. Where did you dig up the material, and which did you find to be the most fruitful as well as interesting sources?
Each restaurant, and there are 10 restaurants, had a different source base. That is both what made it challenging to work on and interesting. In some cases, I had the current owners or former owners. So I could talk to Alice Waters at Chez Panisse or Alex von Bitter, one of the co-owners of the Four Seasons. In other cases, the restaurants no longer exist, or they're so old that while you can reconstruct their recent history, you have to go to written sources for their earlier history. There actually is, for the restaurants, a lot that has been written about them. Often they're in things like the New Yorker or in newspapers. Sometimes there's a kind of published cookbook, as with Sylvia's, 2 cookbooks, in fact, in that case, or Antoine's 1 cookbook that has a lot of biographical or autobiographical information. But to some extent, the selection of restaurants was dictated by the source material that is available. In New Orleans, for example, a lot of people said, well, why didn't you choose Galatoire's instead of Antoine's? Galatoire's is so much more authentically New Orleanian, and Antoine's is more touristy. And I'm not sure that's even true or was true for much of the history of a restaurant that goes back to 1840. But really the main reason is that Antoine's has a lot of material and Galatoire's has very little from its early history.
So if you think about the people who you got to interview for the project, how many of them, of your 10 restaurants, the founders or original starters of the restaurant were still alive? And tell me about some interesting stories that came out of the interviews.
Well, the most interesting interviewee was Cecilia Chang, who was the founder of the Chinese restaurant in my list, the Mandarin. And here again, I choose this restaurant not only because it was innovative in creating northern and other regional Chinese cuisines for a non-Chinese clientele, but because there's a lot of material on it, because Cecilia Chang wrote 2 kind of autobiographical cookbooks. She is the most interesting character, I think, that I've interviewed. She's a legendary figure in the food world. She's now 97. She was about, well, I know she was 92 when I interviewed her, because she said on the phone, oh, I'd be glad to talk to you, but come out soon. I'm 92. San Francisco, she meant. And she's still going very strong, consulting with restaurants, mentoring a lot of chefs and restaurant owners, investing in restaurants, and is a real character and a delightful person to interview. I really learned a lot from her, but also got a sense of what life at its best can be in the food world. But almost everybody I spoke to, well, everybody I spoke to literally was quite forthcoming. All of them have fascinating stories. In Cecilia's case, the story part of your question, I guess, that is the most interesting, and she's a woman who had to flee twice, once from the Japanese, once from the communist revolutionaries. But the most interesting story is that she went to San Francisco in 1960 to be with her sister, whose husband had died, and thought she was going to go back to Japan, where she lived at the time. She met 2 people that she knew from China who were going to open up a Chinese restaurant, and asked her to invest with them, which she did. She also wrote the check for the lease, and then they pulled out, and she discovered that she had a restaurant and an unbreakable lease. And so even though she was a woman in a male world, a northern Chinese in a world dominated by Cantonese, and the restaurant was not in Chinatown, she opened it and made a tremendous success of it, one of the most celebrated Chinese restaurants in American history.
Now, at Babson, we teach entrepreneurship, and certainly anybody who's opening a restaurant, it fits in that bill to being an entrepreneur. We also know from the work of Anthony Bourdain, Kitchen Confidential, as well as some of his other books, that one of the worst businesses to start is a restaurant, and that people say for every 5 restaurants that open, they're closed, 3 of them are closed within the year. What led these people to start these businesses? Was it, I need to make money, I fell into it out of necessity, I needed a job? The whole business part of this, why did they decide to do this?
It varies with each case. Certainly in each case, there's some strain of fanatical energy, attention to detail, and ability to go beyond the quality of the food. So in the case of Sylvia Woods worked at a luncheonette in Harlem and bought the business out from its owner when he was ready to retire. So by the time she actually opened her restaurant, she had a good idea of how to run it. What made Sylvia's unique, I think, was her character, the quality of her welcome, her ability to make people feel happy about her food. Her food was undoubtedly great, but there are lots and lots of restaurants that have good food but can't make a success of it. So in other cases, the Four Seasons, this was opened by a corporate body. It actually didn't make a whole lot of money for a long time. Restaurant Associates sold it. It finally started making money in the 1970s. I'm fascinated by cases where a restaurant either had an instant success, like Delmonico's in New York, or very quick success, like the Mandarin, on the one hand, and restaurants like Chez Panisse or the Four Seasons that took a good 20 years before they would really get their financial footing. So I think people, we're all optimistic. We all know that we're going to die, but we do stuff anyway. We all know that certain kinds of things, applying to college, often come with bad odds, but we think we're exceptional. Or, there are lots of other good tennis players out there, but you try to compete anyway. It's either the statistics that you give are proof of human resilience and optimism, or human foolishness, or maybe a little of each.
We'll be right back. For more interviews and related content, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and other podcast distributors. Also, check out our website at www.fredopie.com. Ask questions on Facebook at Frederick Douglass Opie and on Twitter at Dr. Fred D. Opie. For information about advertising on the show, please email us at fdopie@gmail.com. That's fdopie@gmail.com.
Hey listeners, if you're enjoying this show, you might enjoy the episode entitled Zora Neale Hurston, the culinary tradition of a literary icon. It includes excerpts from a lecture Fred gave at a Zora Neale Hurston-inspired dinner in New York. Here's a clip from that show, which is available on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher.
Finished her high school degree, then she goes to Howard University in D.C. And while she's at Howard, she's working as a waitress. There's a restaurant in Washington, D.C. on U Street called Eatonville, which is named after her town. And she is the thematic of that whole restaurant. So she's there. That restaurant is right across the street from a bookstore called Busboys and Poets. Now, what's interesting is a person whose life almost seemed to be tracking each other, and that's Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes spends time also in Washington, D.C., working as a busboy at a restaurant. Zora's in Washington, D.C., and she's working as a waitress to pay her bills. Well, so these are both two migrants, Langston Hughes from Joplin, Missouri, and Zora from Florida. So they end up there together. They don't know each other while they're in Florida. They meet after Zora publishes she gets her first publication as a student in Howard, and she submits it, and it wins an award. And that's how she becomes recognized by somebody in the literary circles of Howard, and they suggest to her, you should go to New York.
Once again, that was an excerpt from a lecture Fred Opie gave at a Zora Neale Hurston-inspired dinner. That episode of The Dinner Table is available wherever you listen to the show. Now let's get back to Fred's interview with food historian and author Paul Freedman.
Now, I started a series of interviews with restaurant owners perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, and the essential question that drove the research is, why do restaurants succeed or fail? From the 10 that you looked at, what would be your answer to that question?
I guess they succeed because of the personality of a founder. The personality can be different. There's no one personality that's a formula for success. Sometimes it's somebody who's cooking in a recognizable way but just seems to be better than anybody. The founder of Mama Leone's, Louisa Leone, was a entrepreneur in a field that lots of other people had achieved a moderate success in, but she seems to have been a very good cook, good enough to convince Enrico Caruso of her talent, the great opera singer of the time, who prevailed on her husband to let her open a restaurant. In other cases, it's somebody who really figures out the logistics of the restaurant. Howard Deering Johnson, the founder of Howard Johnson's, was one of these early 20th century super managers who could figure out how many little things of tartar sauce you need to set out at the beginning of the meal so that you don't have to bother filling out the little containers, but at the same time you don't waste tartar sauce. And he expended his energy on 1,000 different aspects of that: where to locate the restaurants, what kind of signage to have, paving the parking lots rather than, as was the custom in the 20s and 30s, just leaving them dirt, all sorts of things like that. A third thing is being a warm and welcoming host. The best thing is where you can combine two of those. So I would say that Cecilia Chang, whom I mentioned, the founder of the Mandarin, was both a exacting cook and a host who always wanted to be at the front of the house. I've heard her criticize other restaurants because they let somebody else greet the customers, and she really believed that the owner, the person running the place, had to be on the floor all the time, had to tell people, in the nicest possible way, and educate them as to how to eat their food, what to order, joke with them, make them feel at home. So those are the three ingredients, I would say: welcome, food, and managerial talent.
Very interesting. In terms of things that you, as authors, we all have the experience that some things we take out because our publisher suggests us to take out. What are some of the things that didn't make it into the book?
Well, I actually had trouble narrowing it down to 10. I didn't have any trouble narrowing it down to, 15 or 20. So I didn't have to start out with a huge list and whittle it down painfully. But I had about 12. And the two that didn't make it were French Laundry and Alinea. French Laundry would have been great because it combines the farm-to-table earnestness of Chez Panisse with a somewhat more modernist cuisine, what used to be called molecular gastronomy. And Alinea, a restaurant in Chicago, is the most successful American example of molecular gastronomy. I actually asked my publisher if he thought it was a good idea maybe to just have 12 restaurants, and he was quite firm, saying, this is 10 restaurants that changed America. The number 10 has an instant kind of recognition and orientation. If you do it 12, you're going to lose the point of the book.
Interesting.
So I'm sure you've had the experience of publishers who irritate you, and then you simmer down for a while and realize that they're right.
What's something that you thought would be an outcome when you first started the project? Now, we have these ideals when we go into the archive, and then when you get out and you write the book, what's something that direction you thought the book would go, and at the end you realized you were wrong?
I would say not so much wrong in what occurs to me immediately as misjudged and incomplete. My desire was to tell the story of American cuisine through these restaurants. Story with a somewhat mysterious content and ending, namely, what is American cuisine? Is there such a thing? How did we get to this? Because it's not an instantly recognizable cuisine in the way that, for right or wrong, we kind of have an idea of what Italian cuisine is. If you ask people in much of the world, they think American cuisine is fast food. Or a more flattering term would be, or image would be, food trucks and the variety of international cuisines available in America. I thought I would be able to answer that through the restaurant book, and I think I come up with a story that's more about restaurants and more about dining out than a complete answer or even a complete attempted answer to what is American cuisine. So it's, I think you have to go to outside the restaurant world to the sort of thing that you describe in your books in terms of ordinary people, or the way that the lives of ordinary people are captured in fiction or in documentary description.
Mm-hmm. Paul, tell us a little about your writing practice. Are you a person that tries to write a certain amount of time each day, or is it pages? Do you work in the morning? Do you work on hard copy, or do you work on your computer?
I work on my computer. I'm a morning person, but I, can work in the afternoon and evening fairly well. I guess I'm in the steady, but I wouldn't say slow, but certainly not speedy. So I like to work every day. I don't have a quota of pages or of time. I find that cliches on the order of the longest journey begins with a single step, or, you just kind of write it and do it. I'm fortunate enough not to suffer from writer's block, at least so far, where I don't have the, I really can't face the manuscript, or in the cases where I can't face the manuscript, I've just given up the project. So I get nervous if I'm working on a book. If I can take a vacation, but if I'm around, I work at home. If I don't do some work almost every day, I start to get nervous. So I'm either a great example of someone who's able to write without a whole tremendous amount of pain, or a pathetic case of someone who, while not enjoying writing as a process, seems to be unable to stop.
Interesting. So you're a person that writes 7 days a week, no matter if it's a little bit or a lot.
Well, I don't think I make all 7, but I'd be perfectly happy writing 7 days a week, and some of those days a little, and in fact usually a little. So even if I have a day that I don't have to teach and I'm at home, I can't work 8 hours straight usually. So I need a certain amount of diversion, but I can work with some distractions and in little pieces.
Very interesting. Tell us a little bit about the book tour part of this. Where were you able to go? And one of the things that I always have enjoyed is I learn more about my work and the book from the people that read it and get different insights that I never thought of. So what was your book experience like as far as the promotion part of it?
It was great because I've published a number of other books, but never had an actual book tour. The funny part of the book tour began when I asked my publisher, because I was trying to plan my semester, am I going to have a book tour? And the first response was, book tour? No, that's really so 20th century. We don't do that much anymore. And then a few months later, somebody else called and said, listen, we need to talk about your book tour.
Wow.
So I went to New Orleans, Mississippi, and Nashville. I used to live in Nashville, so I had an event in New Orleans, a couple of little book events in Jackson and Oxford, Mississippi, and then in Nashville. Then I had another trip to Nashville. It's a sort of long story where I did 2 trips there. I had an event in Los Angeles and in San Francisco. So these were, and one in Washington, D.C. These were great. I had always read about authors' book tours. I never thought I'd get to have the experience, both the exhilaration of people asking you fascinating questions and the humiliation of being in a bookstore with a handful of customers. Some of them would just look like they kind of wandered in to get warm. So it's great. As you say, the questions really make you think about what you've done. I certainly changed my mind about certain things. I had anticipated that choosing Mama Leone's as an Italian restaurant would get a lot of pushback, and quite the contrary. Lots of people had very happy memories about it. The question I got most often, which both amused and slightly exasperated me was, why isn't the automat in your book?
Well, why did that bother you? Tell me.
Why does it bother me?
Yeah.
Because the book, I've painfully explained that this is the 10 most influential restaurants. And the automat is evocative. I went there as a kid.
Yeah.
I loved it, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's like, why aren't blimps half of the story of aviation? I'm sorry, blimps are great. They are, unbelievably cool, but they don't happen to have influenced anybody in the sense that nothing follows them.
I see what you're saying. No, we don't have automats in every city across America, so why would I be talking about it?
Exactly, and nobody ever imitated them. And besides, now I sound like I'm ranting, but
no, I love it.
The people who remember the automat forget that in fact it was a cafeteria with some little windows.
Wow.
If you wanted corned beef or pot roast or soup, you had to go to the cafeteria part because that's where the hot food was. The little windows had salads, pie slices, things like that, things that you were room temperature, sandwiches wrapped up. That's what you got when you put nickels in the little windows. But people seem, it was magical to me as a kid. Mm-hmm. But people seem to forget that, in fact, they were called automat cafeterias.
Hmm. What's your work in progress right now? What are you working on?
I'm doing a little bit of stuff on medieval history because that is the interest that I have maintained even through this food adventure. In the food world, I am trying to write something about American cuisine, as I said, based on things like cookbooks or regional guides or descriptions of American folkways. And I think I've identified some factors or features in American cuisine that I'd like to follow out. Regionalism, for example, or that variety of international cuisines that always characterized the United States.
Paul, it's always a delight to talk with you and catch up on what you're doing. Congratulations on the book. I would recommend it to our listeners. It's a great read. And tell everybody the title again.
It's 10 Restaurants That Changed America. And thank you, Fred. It's always a delight speaking with you.
I really like speaking with authors about their writing habits. I always learn something new in the process. And I like to find out how a project began. So speaking with Paul Freedman about this project, 10 Restaurants That Changed the World, and why he decided to choose the 10 he chose was very interesting. I also like what he has to say about the book tour and what he learned along the process. That certainly has been the case with me, that when you get out and present the work, you usually learn more from those who read the book than when you actually wrote the book. To check out our podcast archive, suggest show topics, and advertise on the show, and to book me as a guest and or speaker, visit our website, www.fredopie.com. That's www.fredopie.com. For information about advertising on the show, please email us at fdopie@gmail.com. That's fdopie@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and be good.